There's a certain kind of opening that doesn't shout for your attention so much as it hushes everything else around you, like a hand gently dimming the lamp in a room you thought was already dark, and Luka Duka Lama eases in with exactly that quiet confidence. The first image like a breath you didn't know you were holding, the camera close on a hand tracing a faint scar on the inside of a wrist, a shoreline murmuring out of focus behind it, and the low thread of morning prayers echoing from somewhere inland, as if loss and devotion are just two notes in the same song, and before a word is spoken you feel it in your bones that this is a film about how new wounds awaken old grief, how the present is never really present when the past refuses to sit still, and I'm telling you, as someone who has watched too many stories drift past my screen and then evaporate by the time the credits roll, this one stays. It breathes and clings and sets up camp inside you. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I want to hear how this kind of film lands where you are, what images it stirs up for you, which corners of home it touches that maybe you haven't swept in a while. And I say all that because you don't need any grand manifesto to understand where Luka Duka Lama is coming from. You just need to imagine the soft thud of rain on a zinc roof and a daughter standing at the edge of a doorway she once raced through as a child, slower now, older now, carrying bags and a stubborn ache she won't name, returning to a town that never forgot how to be quiet even when people were shouting inside their own heads, returning because a phone call says her father fell, because new pain demands attendance even when it means the old pain will pull up a chair and ask for tea, and that's the spell of this 2025 release, that it knows time is not a straight line but an old river that revisits its bends with every season, and its director, a voice that feels both seasoned and fresh, is less interested in plot than in pulse, in the heartbeat of moments captured with a patient lens and an ear that knows how honest silence can be, setting the film on a small Javanese coast where the humidity makes everything shine with memory and where nightfall comes with insects and the sea. And when I say it slipped into the year quietly, I mean it didn't come stamping its feet, it just arrived like a relative coming by on a scooter to see if you've eaten, a piece of cinema more intimate than explosive but no less thunderous for the restraint, and that's the point, that it trusts you, trusts the viewer to lean in. It's a simple premise on paper. A young woman named Maya returns to her hometown after her father suffers a minor stroke, and because this kind of story understands that reality is never the tidy version we offer to neighbors and cousins, her return is not triumphant but tentative, folding back on itself like a letter scribbled in too much haste, but you watch her try to stand still in the doorway of a house that held earlier versions of her, and you understand without the film underlining it, that she has not been back in years, not since something she does not talk about, a night she avoids thinking about when she's trying to fall asleep in Jakarta, where everything seems brighter but the shadows know your name and follow you home, and I can feel some of you already bracing for melodrama, but that's not what this is, it's the opposite, it's every unsent message hovering over send, every argument that never reaches a shout because a sigh intercepts it, it's messy but never sensational, it's dignified in the way that working families are dignified, with the weight of daily life pressed into every pot lid and frayed towel, and the way the filmmakers handle that texture tells you they've been paying attention, the kind of attention you can't fake. The release itself is worth noting because this is a film that understands how to find its audience. It's built like a small bridge across rivers of language and geography, subtle in its marketing. A trailer that showed nothing more than a woman on a bus looking out a rain-speckled window and an older man staring at a cracked mirror and a sequence of boys launching a kite while a storm gathers, and sometimes that's enough, just the suggestion of a life, the sense that you'll be given time to know these people rather than being introduced through bolded exposition, and as the months of 2025 have unfolded, word of mouth has done more than any banner ad could, little bits of reaction spilling onto social media, people from different corners of the globe, Indonesian diaspora, and beyond, talking about how a certain scene made them call their father, or how the score brought back a smell they couldn't place, or how the sound design made them feel like they were back in their grandmother's kitchen, the chair scrape, the tin squeak of an old fan, the kettle singing. Spoiler control matters here because this is one of those films where the what is less important than the how, but I'll sketch the outline so you can feel the terrain under your feet. Maya is a photojournalist who's used to chasing stories that belong to other people, where the distance of the lens is a comfort, a barrier, and a shield, but when the call comes from her aunt, she's on a crowded bus by the next morning, the camera finds the tension in her grip, the thumbnail pressed to the camera strap, and the ride home is a collage of faces, fields, and memory fragments that may be literal flashbacks or may simply be the way a human mind loops around certain images, a shoe abandoned in a flooded alley, a kite tangled in a line, a blue enamel bowl with a chip on the rim that used to serve soto on Sundays, and the film doesn't tell you whether these things actually existed or whether they are composites of a feeling, because it knows that sometimes our recollections are partially true, emotionally accurate even when they are factually off, and once Maya arrives, everything is both familiar and shifted, the house smaller, the sky bigger, the laughter of kids on a side road the same notes but a different tempo, and her father, Pak Booty, who always carried himself like a tree, tall and stubborn, is now thinner, his left hand trembling with the memory of when it obeyed him fully, his words sometimes arriving in odd order, but his eyes still clear, and the way the actor plays those eyes is pure, a deep well of things he will not say, love and pride and shame and something else that looks like fear. The early movement of the film is domestic, but this director turns domestic into epic by refusing to flatten it, a scene where Maya tries to replace a light bulb and can't reach, and she refuses to ask for help, standing on a chair that wobbles, and her father, from his seat, growls that he can do it, and you feel both of them confronting not the light but time itself, the old balance of who cared for whom reversed and resisted, and the grandmother, Ibusari, enters with a little laugh and a soft slap on Maya's arm, and the problem resolves not with a speech but with an ease you only get in kitchens where people have cooked together for decades, and I promise you that if you've ever gone home, whether your home is a village or a city block or a suburban cul-de-sac, there's a universal language being spoken here, which is why this film works far beyond its specific setting, because the specifics make the universal possible. There are secondary characters who are not secondary in the way they live on screen. Ayu, Maya's kid sister who never left, who knows the rhythms of the town as well as she knows her own insomnia, and she wears her own scar on the back of her knee, a childhood misstep on a rocky beach that never quite healed right, and Raka, the boy Maya knew when they were teenagers, now a man with the gravity of someone who stayed and therefore became a landmark in the emotional geography of others, and there's a neighbor, Pak Agus, who's always on a porch fixing something that already worked, a stand-in for the way men fix to avoid feeling, and there's also Intan, a bright-eyed kid who helps out at the small market, who sees Maya's camera and asks if it can capture ghosts, which the film allows to hang in the air because every camera captures a ghost if you let it, the ghost of a second before it was gone, the ghost of a smile that never made it to a laugh. And you can sense where this is headed, not towards hauntings, but towards memory's insistence on being seen. The thread that binds the new wound to the old sorrow is unraveled gently, and I won't say exactly how, because this is one of those rare features where a revelation matters not for the shock of it but for its grace, but I will say that Maya's return coincides with the monsoon arriving early, the rains beginning a few weeks ahead of when the farmers expected, and the community's rhythm is thrown off, and there's a night when the drainage canals overflow and the fish vendor's wife prays too loud. And in the morning the sun is a tired coin, and they find something they didn't expect near the mangroves, something that places the whole household in a tension they've practiced ignoring, and that's when you start to hear, in snatches of dialogue and the gaps between them, the shape of an older story, a graduation party that never happened, a walk home that was cut short, a promise not kept, the quick, embarrassed glance between father and daughter when a neighbor's name is mentioned, the lavender smell of a scarf that is too carefully folded in a drawer that's supposed to hold old manuals and tape, not memory. And that's where the title does its work, that's where it starts to make a different kind of sense, because the film shows us how life refuses to present us with clean chapters, it gives us new ink on a page that already had writing on it, and we can pretend the words don't bleed into each other, but of course they do. There's this motif the director leans into that I loved, hands doing ordinary things with reverence, and the cinematography leans in close enough that it feels like a character study in the language we speak without words, hands preparing rice, hands applying medicine to a cut, hands threading a kite string, hands opening a letter that's been taped shut and retaped and then hidden under a floorboard, and I'm telling you, the sound design turns these gestures into a symphony, a new wing on the House of Silence where we all live sometimes, and the score is restrained, percussive when it needs to remind you of heartbeats, and then it vanishes so the sea can talk, and the sea talks a lot in this film, which is fitting because the sea knows everything about absence, it's the politest graveyard, and it's a mirror, which is why when Maya finally looks at it long enough she sees herself as a girl and as the woman she is, and that's one of the clearest miracles here, that this is a story that arrives at the improbable by taking steps any of us could take, one small conversation, one short walk, one glance through a window before bed. As a piece of cinema, Luka Duka Lama is confident enough to be patient, and there are going to be audiences that struggle with that patience, especially in a year where so much is fast and loud, but if you give it your time, it gives you back something like acceptance, not the easy acceptance of people who move on quickly but the slow acceptance of people who know moving on is a myth and that the real skill is moving with, carrying what you carry without letting it drag you completely under, and what brings that home are the performances, which are uniformly tuned to the same key, no one aiming at award season fireworks, everyone rooted in the kind of truth that brings awards down off their shelves and into the street where life happens, and I must talk about the actor playing Maya because she carries the film without ever turning herself into a martyr. The camera watches her watch, and you believe what you see in her eyes even when she's saying the opposite out loud, and the scene where she meets Raka for the first time in a decade is such an example of restraint. You can see history blow through both of their faces like a wind they forgot the shape of, and neither of them spells it out with a monologue, they just stand and talk about nothing for a second too long, one of those moments that tells you everything by telling you nothing, and Pak Budi is all gesture too, the slight hitch in his step, the way he straightens the framed photo of his wife every morning without looking directly at it, as if glances are a form of respect, and Ibusari is the glue, the old kind of wisdom that doesn't call itself wisdom because it doesn't need to be seen in order to work, the kind of grandmother who hums songs from a history you didn't know your blood remembered until her voice unlocks something in you, and she has this line where she tells Maya that the body keeps not only score but story, and it lands because by then you've watched the body be a character in its own right, scars, tremors, the strength it takes to cut through a tough yam, the fragility of bones that want to rest, and the tenderness of tending, how caring for someone's settings, their house, their chair, their cup, is caring for them even when words fail. The director plays with time in quiet ways that never draw circles around themselves. Flashbacks bleed into the present not as tacked on explanatory notes but as pieces of the same quilt, and you can tell a lot from the way the light shifts in those moments, the present a little sharper, blues pulled closer into the skin of the film, the past warmer but slightly grainy, like the memory of a photograph rather than the photograph itself. And there's a beautiful scene in which Maya discovers an old roll of film in her father's toolbox, and she has it developed by a young man in town who's obsessed with analog as a way of saving what he calls the hum of old things, and when the photos come back, they are not revelations, they are not smoking guns, they are just ordinary moments, someone laughing too hard at a small joke, someone looking away at the exact instant the shutter closes, a shot of the sea that looked different back then but you can't say why, and that's where the film's philosophy is nested, that meaning accrues not because of what we think is monumental but because of how we hold the ordinary, and if cinema is a technology for remembering, then this film is a technology for remembering how to remember without turning it into a science project, more like a ritual, a shared ritual. The emotional architecture is meticulous, and you can feel it in the pacing, the way tension builds in little eddies instead of dramatic spikes, and because it's honest, the film lets you get frustrated when conversations end just as they are getting somewhere, because that's how it works in kitchens and on porches, and when the disruptions come, they are small but seismic, a letter that falls out of a book, a cut on a hand from carelessness you later realize wasn't carelessness at all, the choice to go to a certain beach at a certain hour, and I'm not going to ruin a third act choice that the film's been gesturing towards since minute one, but I'll say this, more happens in silence there than in the shouting, and when someone finally speaks, it's one of those lines that a lesser film would have framed as a thesis. But here it is just a human trying to be honest and failing and then being honest anyway, and when the words land, they don't so much solve anything as allow a door to stay open that everyone had given up on, and if you've ever needed to hear someone say I'm sorry in a way that didn't erase the damage but recognized it, you'll understand how these characters breathe a little easier after. There's a cultural specificity that feels like a gift rather than a barrier, and it helps that the film is not interested in explaining itself to an outsider, it invites you in. And if you don't know the ritual of Sunkaman during certain holidays, where you kneel and ask for forgiveness from your elders, you will learn everything you need to from a single visual of a hand that trembles when it hovers and then steadies when it rests on a lap. And if you don't know the cadence of the morning call and the bustle of the market at dawn, the film trusts your ears to catch on, and it respects bakso sellers and fishermen and teachers and housewives and the kids who run errands on motorbikes as gravely as it would any hero, and that respect is contagious. It flows from the production design to the casting to the extras who are not extras at all but the lifeblood of a convincingly lived-in world, and from a graphical perspective, the film uses color to whisper rather than shout, sea greens and ash grays and the ochre of evening, and then every once in a while a sudden burst of red, a dress drying on a line, a paper lantern caught on a nail, a koi in a pond darting just so, and you remember that color is memory's cousin. It brings back what we forgot in a rush. Given that we are a channel that spends a lot of time with story-driven games, it makes sense that this film hit us where we live. There's a certain kinship with the kind of slow-burn narratives gaming has embraced in the last decade, where your choices aren't about explosions but about whether you stay or go, whether you tell the truth or preserve someone's illusion, whether you forgive or replay the pain. And I felt that same agency radiating from Maya's world even when the script didn't give her explicit choices, because life is always asking something of us, and this film is carefully attuned to the way the everyday becomes a branching path, the way a cup of tea becomes a gesture of peace or resistance depending on the angle of the cup when it's offered, and the camera becomes a mechanic, zooming out when perspective is needed, lingering close when intimacy risks becoming a wound, and the editors are clearly fluent in that language, cutting together not based on action but based on empathy, putting a shot of a sleeping dog next to a shot of a sleeping father so you feel the same protective desire wash over both images, and later, interlacing a scene of Maya rinsing rice with a shot of the sea rinsing stones, and it sounds simple but that's how you create cinema that lives past itself, by showing the world through the poetry it's always muttered under its breath. I want to talk about one sequence because it's as close to a set piece as this film gets, the night swim, and if you've seen it you're already nodding, you know, and if you haven't, don't worry. I won't spoil the sequence's core revelation, but there's a night when the moon is high and the tide is somewhere between teeth and tongue, and Maya goes down to the water alone, and this is intercut with Pak Budi in his chair fingering a small bead bracelet you've only seen twice before and didn't think mattered, and Raka walking a shoreline on the opposite side of town, and the staging is such that you feel all of them connected by the same water, and the sound drops out for a second, the score holding a single note you feel more than hear, and then, as the camera tilts up, phosphorescence blooms around her hand in the water, as if the sea itself is remembering, and it's gorgeous but it's not gratuitous. It's anchored in something the film has been quietly building toward, because the light that wakes when water is disturbed is such an apt metaphor for memory, for how what is buried in the dark glows when you dare to touch it, and the cut to the bead bracelet and then to the photograph of a younger woman we've seen face down on a shelf for an hour of screen time but never really looked at. Man, that's the kind of emotional geometry you don't get by accident. It requires a plan and a patience and a belief that the audience is smart enough to draw connections without having their hands held. If there's a knock to be made, if you wanted to sit in a hard chair and be clinical, you could say that the second act dawdles in places, that there are two sequences in particular, one involving a long walk through a grove of coconut trees where not much is said, another involving a stop at a roadside stall where the tea is poured slowly and the conversation is slower, that might test viewers whose patience has been frayed by screens demanding constant novelty, but I'd argue those sequences do the quiet labor of letting the dust settle in your chest so you can see the shape of things, and even if the film lingers a beat too long, the after effect is stronger because of it. The third act lands not like a hammer but like a hand on your shoulder, steadying you, and when the credits finally roll, if you've given the film your concentration, you might sit there for a minute listening to the night around you, recalibrating a little. And that in itself is evidence of the film's craft, that it modifies your pace for a while rather than letting the world drag you back into itself half a step ahead of your breath. Thematically, Luka Baru Duka Lama is obviously concerned with grief, but it's not a grief porn hustle. It's not interested in suffering for suffering's sake, it's interested in what grief does to our sense of time and self, how it spins us into spirals where repetition feels like safety even when it hurts us, and there's a particular focus on intergenerational patterns, the way a father's silence becomes a daughter's distance, the way a grandmother's resilience becomes a granddaughter's stubbornness, the way forgiveness sometimes looks like betrayal to those outside of it, and you can trace those themes through actual objects on screen, like the aforementioned bracelet, like the anemia pills Maya finds near the stove and the care with which she puts them back exactly as they were, not moving things around because she knows that presence matters more than order, and through metaphors that the film refuses to hammer to death, like water, like light, like the most obvious one. Scars, but even scars are handled gently, no hero shots showing off damage, just the way the skin knows where it has been, and the way a lover or a child learns to navigate the topography of those scars. That's love on screen, and speaking of love, this is not a romance in the conventional sense, but there is love here, the kind that's knotted and durable, not because it's perfect but because it refuses to be otherwise. The love between a father and a daughter who both made mistakes, the love between siblings that has calcified into roles they don't know how to escape, the love of a place for its people, which is maybe what we mean when we talk about home. And if you've had to leave yours and then found yourself standing in a familiar doorway years later, you'll see yourself in the way Maya hesitates, then laughs at herself for hesitating, then steps in anyway. Performance highlights deserve to be singled out without breaking the film's spell, and since this is a review and not a eulogy, let's go there. The actor playing Maya communicates currents with micro-expressions that would be lost in a lesser lens, but here they are treasured: a twitch at the corner of the mouth that could be a smirk or a sob kept in check, a blink that comes half a second too late when her father says her name with a softness that could kill you, a willingness to let herself look ugly when she cries instead of producing screen tears, the kind that are pretty but tell no truth, and Pak Budi is stoic in a way that feels earned, his stubbornness a product not of pride for its own sake but of the belief that his role is to be the anchor even when his chain has rusted, and in one scene he's trying to tie a knot and failing, and the actor lets us live in that failure long enough to feel it, then breaks the tension with a joke so little it might go unheard if you're not leaning forward, and that's humane, that's what people do to keep from shattering. And Ibu Sari is a marvel, at once ancient and sharp. She never turns into a caricature of the wise elder, because the film gives her contradictions, a pettiness about a neighbor's gossip, a fondness for songs she pretends not to remember, a petty greed about a particular brand of coffee that makes her hoard packets in a tin, and that three-dimensionality is a kindness, a reminder that old age is not a singular story either, that people are led till they are gone, and I might be the audience's surrogate, asking the questions we want to ask and then rescinding them when she senses that asking might break something fragile. And Raka is the kind of man who knows when to leave a scene, and that's a gift to everyone, not because he's weak but because he's allowed to know that sometimes presence is pressure and absence is permission, and the way he leaves that night in the rain, looking back not at Maya, but at the house itself, like he's asking it to watch her, that's a director trusting their actors to find the small gestures that ring louder than anything. Audience reaction is often a Rorschach, but from what I've seen and felt in the wake of this film's release, it's been an invitation to talk about things people don't normally bring up in bright rooms: parents who weren't ready, the way love breaks when it's asked to carry too much too soon, the guilt of leaving, the longing for the version of yourself that still lived in that dusty room with the peeling poster and the wobbly fan. And there's been a particular resonance among viewers navigating diaspora identities, the sense of being both here and there, of inheriting sorrow alongside recipes and lullabies, and as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about narrative in games and films both, I'm always struck by how a work like this can act as a mirror for people far outside its immediate context, and that's the cultural impact that actually matters, not the numbers, but the conversations and the open doors and the apologies sent late at night and the phone calls made in the morning and the walks taken in silence that feel like prayers. And to the extent that the film has been talked about in those terms, it has already done something worthwhile, and if it nudges an industry skewed toward speed and spectacle to make more room for works that move at the speed of breath and memory, then amen to that too. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about craft choices that speak to a guiding intelligence running through every department. The costume design is unglamorous in the best sense, clothes that look worn the way real clothes do, a shirt that's been washed 100 times and has grown tender at the collar, a dress with a repair stitch that becomes a tiny scar to mirror Maya's own, sandals that have known mud, and the production design extends that love to props that matter, not because they scream theme at you but because they are seen, the aforementioned enamel bowl, the chipped mirror, the way the kitchen door sticks just a little in the humidity, and the sound of that stick becomes a cue for the way the day feels, and the cinematography is, frankly, a lesson in humility, low angles that humanize rather than mythologize, long takes that force your heart to adjust, primes that keep you close without invading, and a handful of drone shots that are used sparingly, to remind you of the town's spinal geography, the main road like a thin ribbon, the field like a quilt, the sea like a companion. I want to put a bow on the editing too, because it creates a rhythm that makes the final scenes inevitable but not predictable, and that's not easy. It's the difference between melodrama and drama, between catharsis and manipulation, and when the scene comes where Maya finally asks her father the question we all knew was coming, the cutaway to the grandmother's hands, the way the kettle starts to sing, the way we don't immediately return to faces but sit with the sound for a beat, we're being protected and prepared at once, and then we are allowed to hear the answer, not all of it, only the parts an ordinary human could summon without rehearsing for years, and the partialness is what makes it land, because in real life, there is never a full explanation that fixes the past, there is only the courage to say what can be said and the grace to hold the rest. The title never stops working on you as you watch. Luka baru Duka Lama, new wound, old sorrow, and it's not a statement so much as an observation, a hand on your shoulder reminding you that pain has a genealogy, that experiences anchor themselves to one another in strange ways, and that sometimes healing comes not from closing everything up but from opening the window and letting two different breezes cross, because the film is wise enough to know that the past is not a chain shackling us, it's a rope that can be used to climb or to tie or to pull something from the sea, and if you catch the look on Maya's face in the last shot, you'll understand, she's not fixed, she's not fine, she's not redeemed, she's simply someone who can carry her grief in a different way now, like you'd move a bag from one shoulder to the other to ease a bruise, and yes, that might not sound like much if you crave fireworks, but to anyone who's had to live in a body through the long seasons of loss, that exchange is profound. And if you've had to leave yours and then found yourself standing in a familiar doorway years later, you'll see yourself in the way Maya hesitates, then laughs at herself for hesitating, then steps in anyway. Performance highlights deserve to be singled out without breaking the film's spell, and since this is a review and not a eulogy, let's go there. The actor playing Maya communicates currents with micro-expressions that would be lost in a lesser lens, but here they are treasured, a twitch at the corner of the mouth that could be a smirk or a sob kept in check, a blink that comes half a second too late when her father says her name with a softness that could kill you, a willingness to let herself look ugly when she cries instead of producing screen tears, the kind that are pretty but tell no truth, and Pak Budi is stoic in a way that feels earned, his stubbornness a product not of pride for its own sake but of the belief that his role is to be the anchor even when his chain has rusted, and in one scene he's trying to tie a knot and failing and the actor lets us live in that failure long enough to feel it, then breaks the tension with a joke so little it might go unheard if you're not leaning forward, and that's humane, that's what people do to keep from shattering. And Ibusari is a marvel, at once ancient and sharp, she never turns into a caricature of the wise elder, because the film gives her contradictions, a pettiness about a neighbor's gossip, a fondness for songs she pretends not to remember, a petty greed about a particular brand of coffee that makes her hoard packets in a tin, and that three-dimensionality is a kindness, a reminder that old age is not a singular story either, that people are layered till they are gone, and I might be the audience's surrogate, asking the questions we want to ask and then rescinding them when she senses that asking might break something fragile, and Raka is the kind of man who knows when to leave a scene, and that's a gift to everyone, not because he's weak but because he's allowed to know that sometimes presence is pressure and absence is permission, and the way he leaves that night in the rain, looking back not at Maya, but at the house itself, like he's asking it to watch her, that's a director trusting their actors to find the small gestures that ring louder than anything. Audience reaction is often a Rorschach, but from what I've seen and felt in the wake of this film's release, it's been an invitation to talk about things people don't normally bring up in bright rooms, parents who weren't ready, the way love breaks when it's asked to carry too much too soon, the guilt of leaving, the longing for the version of yourself that still lived in that dusty room with the peeling poster and the wobbly fan, and there's been a particular resonance among viewers navigating diaspora identities, the sense of being both here and there, of inheriting sorrow alongside recipes and lullabies, and as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about narrative in games and films both, I'm always struck by how a work like this can act as a mirror for people far outside its immediate context, and that's the cultural impact that actually matters, not the numbers, but the conversations and the open doors and the apologies sent late at night and the phone calls made in the morning and the walks taken in silence that feel like prayers, and to the extent that the film has been talked about in those terms, it has already done something worthwhile, and if it nudges an industry skewed toward speed and spectacle to make more room for works that move at the speed of breath and memory, then amen to that too. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about craft choices that speak to a guiding intelligence running through every department. The costume design is unglamorous in the best sense, clothes that look worn the way real clothes do, a shirt that's been washed 100 times and has grown tender at the collar, a dress with a repair stitch that becomes a tiny scar to mirror Maya's own, sandals that have known mud, and the production design extends that love to props that matter, not because they scream theme at you but because they are seen, the aforementioned enamel bowl, the chipped mirror, the way the kitchen door sticks just a little in the humidity, and the sound of that stick becomes a cue for the way the day feels, and the cinematography is, frankly, a lesson in humility, low angles that humanize rather than mythologize, long takes that force your heart to adjust, primes that keep you close without invading, and a handful of drone shots that are used sparingly, to remind you of the town's spinal geography, the main road like a thin ribbon, the field like a quilt, the sea like a companion. I want to put a bow on the editing too, because it creates a rhythm that makes the final scenes inevitable but not predictable, and that's not easy. It's the difference between melodrama and drama, between catharsis and manipulation, and when the scene comes where Maya finally asks her father the question we all knew was coming, the cutaway to the grandmother's hands, the way the kettle starts to sing, the way we don't immediately return to faces but sit with the sound for a beat, we're being protected and prepared at once, and then we are allowed to hear the answer, not all of it, only the parts an ordinary human could summon without rehearsing for years, and the partialness is what makes it land, because in real life, there is never a full explanation that fixes the past, there is only the courage to say what can be said and the grace to hold the rest. The title never stops working on you as you watch, Luka baru Duka Lama, New Wound, Old Sorrow, and it's not a statement so much as an observation, a hand on your shoulder reminding you that pain has a genealogy, that experiences anchor themselves to one another in strange ways, and that sometimes healing comes not from closing everything up but from opening the window and letting two different breezes cross, because the film is wise enough to know that the past is not a chain shackling us, it's a rope that can be used to climb or to tie or to pull something from the sea, and if you catch the look on Maya's face in the last shot, you'll understand, she's not fixed, she's not fine, she's not redeemed, she's simply someone who can carry her grief in a different way now, like you'd move a bag from one shoulder to the other to ease a bruise, and yes, that might not sound like much if you crave fireworks, but to anyone who's had to live in a body through the long seasons of loss, that exchange is profound. There are some film titles that already hurt before the opening scene even begins, and Luka baru Duka Lama is one of those films where the name alone feels like a confession, like something your friend would whisper to you at 3 in the morning when they finally decide to open up about the stuff they said they were over years ago but never really were, and from the moment this movie starts, it's like that late-night conversation never ends. It just keeps going, peeling back layers of old shame and new pain, asking you quietly, almost gently, how much you're really willing to feel tonight, and whether you're ready to admit that healing isn't a straight line, it's a spiral, always bringing you back to the same place, just at a slightly different height. Luka baru Duka Lama is a 2025 Indonesian drama that doesn't just want you to watch it, it wants you to sit with it, to sit with yourself. And as somebody who spends most of my time talking about games, cutscenes, and big boss fights, I didn't expect this film to hit me the way it did, like a save file you thought you deleted suddenly loading back up on your screen with every mistake still there, every choice staring you in the face. And before we dive too deep into it, I want you to stay with me through this story, because it's not just a review, it's a walk through something raw, something that might look dangerously similar to your own life in ways you weren't prepared for. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I really want to know how this film lands in different parts of the world, how different cultures hear this title, and whether New Wounds, Old Sorrows means the same thing to you that it does to me, because, honestly, the more I sit with this movie, the more it stops feeling like a local story and starts feeling like a universal checkpoint that everyone eventually has to hit in their own personal game. So let's talk about where this all comes from, because context matters with a film like this. Luka baru Duka Lama is the latest work from director Nadia Pratiwi, a filmmaker who has spent years in the indie scene quietly building up a reputation for telling small, intimate stories that somehow feel massive in emotional scale. And in 2025 she finally steps into the mainstream spotlight with this movie that feels both deeply Indonesian and completely borderless, like a song in a language you don't technically understand but can still cry to because the melody does all the translation for you. Shot on the western coast of Java, set primarily in a small seaside town that feels trapped somewhere between memory and modernity, the film centers on a young woman in her early 30s named Olya, played with this fragile, raw intensity by newcomer Maya Ardana, whose performance is so natural it almost stops feeling like acting and more like someone accidentally left a camera on during a real breakdown. The film dropped in local cinemas early in the year and almost immediately people started talking about it, not in that hype train blockbuster way, but in that soft, trembling, have you seen it yet, I need to talk to someone way, the kind of way people talk after they've experienced something that rearranges how they remember their own life. The story, at least on the surface, is simple, deceptively simple, the kind of setup you think you've seen 100 times in dramas, but here it's treated not like cliché, but like ritual. we meet Olya in Jakarta, where she works as a nurse in a busy hospital emergency ward, moving through fluorescent-lit corridors with practiced efficiency, her life seemingly filled with other people's crises, other people's blood, other people's last words, and from the first few minutes you sense that she's most comfortable when the problems in the room don't belong to her. There's a scene right at the beginning where a boy comes in with a deep cut on his arm from a motorcycle accident. He's sobbing, his mother is panicking, and Olya is calm, robotic almost, cleaning, stitching, comforting in this slightly detached tone. And then later, alone in the locker room, she's staring at a small white scar on her own wrist like it's a blinking cursor on a screen, waiting for a story she refuses to type. That's the first time the camera really lingers on the idea of wounds, how some are controlled, explained, textbook, and others are these silent, personal glitches in the code of your life that you just try to scroll past. The inciting incident comes in fast, a phone call in the middle of her shift, the hospital lights reflected in her eyes as we hear only her half of the conversation, her shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly, the sound around her muffling as if someone turned down the volume on the world. Her younger cousin Laras tells her that her estranged father has had a stroke back in their coastal hometown of Waringin, and he's asking for her, specifically her, the daughter he hasn't seen in over a decade, the daughter who left and never came back, who moved to the city and cut off her roots like dead weight. You can almost see the war inside her in that single, silent beat between hanging up the phone and taking a breath, the part of her that is a nurse, trained to respond to emergencies, wanting to move, and the part of her that is a child, hurt and hardened, wanting to do absolutely nothing. The film doesn't spell out her decision through dialogue. Instead we just cut to a bus winding along the coastal highway, a plastic bag of cheap snacks hanging above her seat, old pop songs playing faintly from the driver's radio, and that's where the real movie starts, a woman returning to the scene of her childhood like someone reluctantly re-entering a dungeon they rage quit years ago because the boss was too hard and the loot didn't feel worth the pain. From there, the story tracks Olya's return to Waringin, a town that is both familiar and unrecognizable, still bearing the physical and emotional scars of a massive storm that hit when she was a teenager, the night that changed everything for her family. It's one of those places that feels like it's been left out of time, with newly built cafes sitting awkwardly next to rusted fishing boats, teenagers scrolling on their phones while their grandparents still tell stories about waves as if they are living, breathing monsters. Spoiler-wise, I want to be respectful, because this is one of those movies where knowing every plot turn ahead of time could rob you of those small, precise stabs that the story is carefully building toward, so I'm going to focus more on the emotional architecture rather than giving you a Wikipedia-style rundown. What matters is that Olya's father, Hendra, is now partially paralyzed, trapped in the same house where every major wound of her life seems to have originated, and he's not the towering, angry man she remembers. He's quieter, frailer, but that almost makes it worse, because how do you aim all your stored-up rage at someone who can barely lift his arm, someone whose voice shakes when he calls your name? The film plays with that discomfort beautifully, never letting you fully settle into victim or villain roles, constantly asking whether people who hurt you deserve your care when they are broken, and what it costs you to give it to them. Against this central father-daughter tension, we meet the rest of the town as living reminders of who Olya was before she decided to become someone else entirely. There's Raka, the neighbor boy who used to race her down to the beach when they were kids, now a local fisherman and amateur musician, trying to keep his late father's boat business alive while singing at small bars at night. Someone who never left Waringin and wears that choice with a complicated mix of pride and resentment. There's Ibu Sari, the elderly widow who practically raised the whole neighborhood, whose tiny food stall near the harbor is still the unofficial gossip hub, and who looks at Olya with a mixture of warmth and unspoken judgment. That "you're back now but you weren't here when it mattered" kind of gaze. And then there's little Nisa, a teenage girl who idolizes Olya instantly, asking her a million questions about city life, about hospitals and high-rise buildings and whether people really drink coffee in those tall paper cups like in the dramas, a child who hasn't yet learned the weight of words like trauma, absentee, regret, but is already collecting tiny cuts of disappointment that will bloom into those words later. As Olya moves through these interactions, you start to sense what the film is actually doing beneath the surface. It's drawing this intricate map of grief across generations, showing how an old communal wound like a natural disaster ripples out over time, not just in infrastructure and poverty, but in the private rituals of silence families adopt to keep going. Luka Baru Duka Lama is not a disaster film in the traditional sense. You almost never see the storm itself, instead you see the echo of The storm in the way a father flinches at thunder or a mother obsessively checks the window whenever the rainfall gets a little heavier, and through flashbacks that are stitched carefully throughout the narrative, the movie slowly reveals why Olya cannot look at the sea without her jaw tightening, why every time someone mentions the night the water came, she finds a reason to stand up, to leave the room, to make tea, to do anything but sit still. The structure of the film mirrors that avoidance. Early on, the flashbacks are quick, almost like stray thoughts. A shot of a wet floor, a red plastic sandal floating in murky water, a hand gripping a door frame in the dark, and then we're back to present-day Olya, back to the awkward dinners where Hendra tries to make small talk, back to the visits from neighbors who say things like, "Your father talks about you all the time," while Olya tries not to roll her eyes, because she remembers a very different man, a man whose love felt like a chore chart, something you had to complete to earn a rare moment of softness. What's fascinating is how Nadia Pratiwi refuses to let the story fall into the easy trap of strict father, misunderstood daughter. Instead, she frames their relationship like a constantly shifting camera angle, sometimes inviting you to stand behind Olya, seeing Hendra as this looming presence who prioritized discipline over affection, who shoved away her tears with phrases like, "Stop being dramatic," and "Other people have it worse," and then, in other scenes, placing you quietly behind Hendra's shoulder, watching him stare at an old family photo on the wall, tracing the outline of young Olya with his trembling finger, mouthing apologies he never says out loud. It's this dual storytelling that makes Luka Baru Duka Lama so emotionally exhausting in the best way, because you're never allowed to fully hate anyone, not even when they absolutely earn your anger, and that's a pretty accurate mirror of real life. Rarely are our villains complete monsters, they are usually just deeply broken people whose brokenness happen to intersect disastrously with our own. Cinematically, the movie has this understated beauty that doesn't scream for your attention but rewards it if you're willing to sit still. The color palette leans heavily into muted blues and washed-out browns, like old photographs that have been left in the sun too long, and the camera loves to linger on hands, on everyday objects, almost like a point-and-click adventure game where the environment itself holds the clues to what really happened here. There's a recurring image of a cracked ceramic bowl on the family table, glued together so carefully that from far away you can't see the damage, but up close every vein of the breakage is visible, and that bowl just sits there through scene after scene, as people come and go, eat and argue and laugh around it, and I couldn't help but think of how we do that with ourselves, how we present from a distance like whole, functional vessels while praying no one comes close enough to see the glue. It's not subtle symbolism, but it works. Because the film never pokes at it with a neon sign, it just lets it be part of the furniture of their lives. And then there are the sounds. The sound design of Luka Baru Duka Lama is almost a character in itself, because there's this constant low hum of the sea in the background, even when it's not directly in frame, reminding you that this town lives in a kind of permanent dialogue with water, with the memory of that one night when the tide came too far inland, rain on the tin roof during an argument, the way a distant thunderclap interrupts Hendra right when he's about to say something important. The use of silence when Olya is alone in her childhood bedroom, looking at old posters peeling off the wall, hearing only her own breath and the faint chatter of neighbors downstairs, all of these choices create a kind of emotional weather system that hovers over the scenes. If you're someone who's into games with strong environmental storytelling, like walking simulators where half of the narrative is conveyed through how a room looks, this film will feel very familiar in spirit, because Nadia Pratiwi directs like someone who understands that a crooked frame on the wall can sometimes speak louder than a monologue. Now, let's talk about the heart of this whole thing, Olya herself, and the other characters who orbit her like small moons, tugged by the gravity of her unresolved past. Maya Ardana's performance just aches in every frame, and what I love about the way she plays Olya is that she never makes her likable in an easy way. She's prickly, defensive, often unfair to the people around her, and yet you can see exactly where it's coming from. She laughs a little too loud at jokes that aren't that funny. She over-explains her decisions as if anticipating judgment. She avoids eye contact during tender moments, and when she finally does break, it's not in one clean, beautiful cinematic cry, it's in those ugly, hiccuping sobs where you're half laughing at yourself for losing control, the kind of crying where you apologize even as you're doing it, because somewhere along the line you picked up the belief that your pain is inconvenience for other people. Opposite her, Hendra, played by veteran actor Arman Prakoso, is a masterclass in restrained guilt. He spends much of the movie in a wheelchair or propped up with a cane, his body clearly diminished, and yet in the small flickers of his expression you can still see the man he used to be, the strict, prideful father who measured love in sacrifice and endurance instead of hugs and words. There's a scene about halfway through the movie that absolutely gutted me, where Hendra is trying to button his own shirt for the first time after the stroke, his fingers clumsy, the fabric stiff, and Olya, standing in the doorway, watches him struggle, torn between the urge to help and the stubborn decision to let him feel helpless the way she once did. The camera holds the moment uncomfortably long, and eventually, without a word, she approaches and takes over, her hands moving quickly, clinically, like she's at the hospital again, and when she's done, instead of a thank you, Hendra mutters something like, "You always were good with your hands," in this almost nostalgic tone, and you can see her flinch, because for her those hands are also the ones that remembers the sting of his belt, the times he grabbed her wrist too tightly, and the film never resolves that contradiction with a neat bow, it just lets them both exist, side by side, as they do in real memory. Raka, the childhood friend and soft potential love interest, played by Dimas Wirawan, gives the movie some much-needed warmth without turning it into a romance-first narrative. He's the guy who never left, who knows every corner of Wearing In by heart, who jokes about Olya becoming too city, but whose eyes betray a lingering crush he's tried to bury under years of routine. Instead of being a dramatic savior figure, he's more like a bridge between Olya and the town, gently pulling her into spaces she would avoid, like the revamped pier or the new youth center built where an old market once stood, and through his presence we see how pretended indifference to your roots is just another form of grief. There's one scene where they are sitting on the beach at night, the waves just a dark line in the distance, sharing a cheap bottle of soda like they used to as kids, and he asks her, without judgment, is it better there, meaning the city, the life she chose, and she hesitates for so long before answering that the pause itself feels like the real answer. When she finally says, it's louder, you realize that this entire film is preoccupied with volume, with all the things Olya has turned up in her life to drown out the quieter, more persistent echo of what she left behind. On the thematic level, Luka Duka Lama is wrestling with two big questions that I think almost anyone can relate to, regardless of where you're from. First, what do we owe the people who wounded us once they become vulnerable? And second, can you ever really move forward without looking back, or is the whole idea of leaving your past behind just a comforting lie we tell ourselves while dragging a suitcase full of unresolved baggage everywhere we go? The movie doesn't answer these questions with some tidy voiceover at the end. It explores them through patterns, through repeated images, through the way Olya's body language slowly changes from defensive to exhausted to something that looks almost like acceptance. The new wound in the title, the Luka Baru, is obviously her father's stroke, this sudden event that forces her out of her carefully constructed present, but as the film unfolds, you start to notice other new wounds forming in real time, the way her relationship with Lara's begins to fracture as old secrets surface, the way Nisa's idealized image of adults starts to crack, the way Raka has to confront his own bitterness at being the one who stayed, and even the town itself, which is slowly being chipped away by economic shifts and climate uncertainty, bearing not just the scar of the storm years ago, but the daily abrasions of neglect. The old sorrow, the Duka Lama, is layered. There's the obvious shared trauma of the storm, but there's also the quieter, more insidious sorrow of generational patterns, of men who were taught that emotions are weakness passing that poison down to their sons and daughters, of women who were taught to endure and endure until their backs bend, of children who internalize the idea that love is something you earn by being good enough, obedient enough, invisible enough. The movie is interested in how these patterns are encoded in family rituals, in the way they pray together, eat together, stay silent together, and it asks, very gently but firmly, what it would take to break any of it, if breaking it is even possible without causing more fractures in the process. One of the most powerful sequences in the film comes near the end of the second act, when Olya finally has what I can only describe as an emotional boss battle with her younger self. No, there's no sci-fi time travel or literal double on the screen, but it's staged like a confrontation between two versions of the same character, present-day Olya in her childhood bedroom, late at night, opening a box she's avoided the entire time she's been back, filled with old-school notebooks, a seashell necklace Raka once gave her, a letter she wrote to her mother but never delivered, and as she flips through these artifacts, the film flashes briefly to her as a teenager, barefoot in the same room, scribbling angrily in her journal, shouting through the door at her father, crying silently into her pillow. The editing here is sharp and rhythmic, cutting between then and now like alternating lines of dialogue in a conversation she never had. And by the time she gets to the bottom of the box and finds a photograph she didn't know existed, one that reframes a huge part of her history, you feel as if you've witnessed a lifelong glitch finally loading properly. I won't spoil what's in that photograph, because it's one of those moments that made my whole theater go dead quiet, like that hush when a game reveals the true ending and you realize you were playing a very different story than you thought. But what I can say is that from that point on, Olya's anger starts to loosen into something more complicated, not softer exactly, but less sharp, like a blade that's been used too much and starts to bend. Performance-wise, this entire section is where Maya Ardena absolutely burns through the screen. There's a shot of her just breathing, nothing else, but you feel the weight of 3 decades on every inhale and exhale, and I genuinely believe this movie is going to launch her onto a lot of people's radars, because she has that rare ability to make you feel like you're intruding on somebody's private moment, like you should look away out of respect, even though you physically can't. The pacing of Luka baru Duka Lama is something I think some viewers will struggle with at first, especially if you're used to more plot-driven dramas. It's slow, intentionally so, but not in a draggy, padding for runtime kind of way, more like how certain narrative games take their time letting you walk through empty spaces just to feel the atmosphere, to let the environment breathe. There are long stretches where nothing happens, in the traditional sense, just characters cooking, hanging laundry, sitting in prayer, watching the rain, and yet these are the moments that accumulate like sediment, layering meaning until, by the time a big confrontation finally erupts, you understand every subtextual current underneath it. The film trusts you to connect dots, to sit in those silences without being spoon-fed, and that trust might feel risky for some audiences, because we've been so trained to expect constant stimulation, constant forward movement, that any pause can feel like a glitch. But if you surrender to the rhythm this movie sets, it becomes almost hypnotic. You start noticing tiny shifts, like how Hendra's voice grows slightly steadier over time, how Lara stops finishing Olya's sentences when she realizes their experiences weren't as identical as she thought, how the town soundscape changes from isolated storms to more collective chatter as Olya reintegrates. Speaking of Lara's, she's another standout character who deserves attention. As Olya's younger cousin, she represents that generation caught in between, the ones who grew up in the shadow of their elders' trauma but weren't there for the original event, and her confusion, her impatience. With Olya's silence, her simultaneous admiration and resentment, all of that feels painfully real. She's the one who called Olya about Hendra's stroke, the one who has been doing the unglamorous work of care for years without recognition, and there's a tension between them that stems from Lara's feeling abandoned not just by Hendra and the town's older generation, but by Olya herself, whose escape to the city became proof that leaving was possible, proof that Lara's, for whatever reason, did not take. The film could have easily turned Lara's into a whiny side character, but instead it gives her some of the sharpest lines, the ones that cut through Olya's self-righteousness. There's a heated argument in the kitchen where Olya accuses everyone of enabling Hendra, of rewriting history to make him look better now that he's weak, and Lara's snaps back, "You left, we stayed, so of course our memories are different," and in that one sentence, the film nails something profound about how geography and time alter the stories we tell about the exact same event. Underneath all of this, there's also a quiet but important commentary on mental health, particularly in more traditional communities, where therapy is still a taboo word and trauma is considered something you pray about, not something you unpack with a professional. Olya, having lived in the city and worked in modern healthcare, represents a more clinical, diagnostic way of seeing pain, one that labels and categorizes, whereas the town tends to frame suffering in terms of fate, sin, and endurance, and watching those worldviews clash is fascinating. There's a small but powerful scene where Olya suggests to Lara's that Hendra might be depressed, that his anger all those years wasn't just bad temper, but possibly untreated grief and anxiety after the storm, and Lara's looks at her like she's speaking another language, not because she doesn't understand the words, but because the idea of pathologizing something that has always just been personality in their world feels alien. Later, when Olya tentatively brings up the idea of getting Hendra to see a counselor who occasionally visits the local clinic, her suggestion is met with polite deflection, even mockery by some family members, and you can see her shut down, reminded that not all tools she's picked up in her new life can be safely applied to the old one. Yet the film is careful not to paint one side as enlightened and the other as ignorant. It also shows the limitations of Olya's more modern, clinical mindset, especially in how she initially treats emotions as problems to be solved rather than experienced. trying to fix everything around her like she's still on duty at the hospital, and in doing so, ironically replicating some of her father's rigidness, just in a more sophisticated vocabulary. What makes Luka Duka Lama so effective, in my opinion, is how deeply it trusts the audience's ability to carry these contradictions without demanding an answer, and that trust has clearly resonated with viewers, from early reactions I've seen and conversations I've had with people who watched it. This is one of those films that sparks long post-viewing talks, the kind where you sit on the curb outside the theater or lie awake in bed replaying certain scenes, comparing them to your own family, your own estranged relatives, your own unfinished arguments. In Indonesia, especially among younger audiences, it's already being memed in that bittersweet way where people screenshot particularly painful lines of dialogue and put them over images of sunsets or rainy windows, weaponizing nostalgia to cope with how much it hurts, and you know a film has cut deep when people start joking about it online, not to minimize it, but to manage their own reaction. I've seen comments from people saying things like, "This movie made me want to text my dad and then delete the message," and if that's not the perfect encapsulation of what Luka Duka Lama does to your heart, I don't know what is. Internationally, for those who catch it with subtitles, I imagine the cultural specifics will be both a bridge and a barrier. Some of the nuances around filial duty, religious rituals, and the weight of staying in one's hometown might hit differently depending on your background, but the core emotional beats are so universal that you'd have to be made of stone not to feel at least a twinge of recognition, even if you've never lived in a coastal village, even if your family history isn't marked by a literal storm. You probably know what it's like to walk back into a childhood home and feel your adult armor suddenly become too heavy, too obvious, like you're overdressed for a party that ended years ago. The cinematography enhances that universality by never exoticizing the location. The town is not some picturesque backdrop for a city person's self-discovery. It's a lived-in, breathing place with its own rhythms and flaws, and the camera treats a flickering fluorescent bulb with the same quiet respect as a dramatic ocean sunset. Wide shots of the coastline are often framed through doorways or windows, reminding you that the natural beauty outside is always being mediated by the structures humans have built to protect themselves, structures that sometimes fail spectacularly. There's one particularly arresting image that has stayed with me: Olya standing in the doorway of her house during a heavy rain, watching the water pool in the yard, her body poised as if ready to run, and the shot holds just long enough for you to realize that she's not really looking at the present rain at all. She's seeing the ghost of that old storm, overlaying itself onto the current moment like a double exposure. No dialogue, no music swell, just her breathing slightly faster, one hand gripping the doorframe a little too tightly, and you suddenly understand what post-traumatic stress looks like in the smallest gestures, the ones that rarely get screen time in more sensationalized portrayals. The score, composed by Rini Wibawa, is mostly piano and strings with occasional traditional instruments woven in, and it's used sparingly, almost shyly, coming in to underline certain scenes but never dictating how you should feel. In fact, some of the heaviest moments are underscored by nothing but ambient sound, as if the film is saying, you don't need musical guidance here, you already know what this feels like. When the music does assert itself, it's usually in transitional montages, like a series of shots of Olya helping Hendra with his physical therapy exercises, set against images of the town rebuilding a damaged pier, or Nisa practicing a dance routine for a school event, and these sequences function almost like emotional breathers, giving you time to process before the next hard conversation. Now, I want to touch on something that might be particularly interesting for those of you who, like me, come from a gaming background and are used to thinking about narratives in terms of player choice and branching paths. Luka Duka Lama has this underlying tension between what happened and what could have happened, between the fixed nature of past events and the imagined alternative timelines that haunt Olya's mind. While the film itself is linear, you can feel her constantly running. What if simulations in her head? What if she had stayed? What if she had confronted her father sooner? What if she had never returned at all? And the way Nadia Pratiwi visualizes this is through shots that almost look like they're glitching, like the camera briefly shows you an alternate version of a scene before snapping back to reality. For instance, there's a moment where Olya is serving tea to Hendra and for a split second, we see her throwing the cup against the wall, shards flying, tea splattering like blood, and then in the blink of an eye we're back to the real timeline where she places the cup gently on the table instead. You barely have time to register the difference, but your brain catches it, and it unsettles you, because it feels like catching a glimpse of a rage that never got expressed. Those micro, alternate scenes function almost like non-playable dialogue options in a game, hovering in the background of the actual choices Olya makes, and they emphasize just how much restraint it takes to not blow up, to not burn bridges, even when part of you is screaming for catharsis. The film seems to suggest that in real life, we don't get to reload from a checkpoint if we go with a more dramatic option, so most of us end up swallowing our most impulsive responses, carrying them as invisible scars instead, and that's a chilling thought if you really sit with it. In terms of flaws, because no film is perfect, I think some viewers might feel that certain secondary characters are underexplored. For example, Ibusari, the older neighbor, is such a compelling presence that every time she appears, you feel like there's a whole other movie living behind her eyes, one about her own losses, her own compromises, and while the glimpses we get are haunting, you might walk away wishing the film had spent just a bit more time with her, or with the wider communities. Reaction to Hendra's decline, beyond the hushed gossip. There's also a subplot involving a land dispute that threatens to push some families, including Raka's, off their ancestral plots, which feels like it was meant to broaden the film's commentary on systemic injustice and the slow violence of economic change, but it doesn't get as much narrative oxygen as the family drama, and so it feels a little like a side quest you start but never fully complete. It's there to provide texture, to show that personal grief is happening alongside structural problems, not in some emotional vacuum. But if you're the kind of viewer who likes every introduced thread to be tied off neatly, this might leave you slightly frustrated. Still, for me, those rough edges actually contribute to the sense that we're dropping into a real, messy world where not every storyline gets resolution, people move away, problems get postponed, some questions never get answered, and that's part of the film's refusal to create a fantasy version of healing where everyone sits in a circle and tells the truth for the first time and then walks into the sunset hand in hand. Speaking of healing, the way Luka Duka Lama handles its final act is, in my opinion, one of its biggest strengths. Without giving away the exact beats, I'll say this: it does not opt for a grand, teary confession between Olya and Hendra where everything that's been unsaid is suddenly voiced in a perfectly scripted monologue. Instead, it builds toward a series of small, almost mundane choices that add up to something quietly monumental. A chair is moved closer to a window, a shared meal is eaten without the usual tension, a hand that once inflicted pain now simply trembles, reaching for a glass of water, and whether that hand is met or left hanging becomes the real climax of the story. The movie understands that for relationships that have been broken for years, even a slight shift in tone, a slightly softer word, is a seismic event, and it captures those micro shifts with a patience that I found deeply moving. There is, near the very end, a scene involving the sea that feels like the emotional equivalent of stepping back into a boss arena you swore you'd never enter again, and watching that unfold, I felt a knot in my own chest I didn't know I'd been holding loosen a little, not because the film told me that forgiveness is mandatory, but because it showed that sometimes, facing the place where everything went wrong is less about the other person and more about reclaiming your own narrative, about proving to yourself that you can stand there, in that memory, and not drown. When the credits finally rolled, my theater stayed dark and still for longer than usual. Nobody jumped up immediately to leave. There was this collective sense of people needing a second to reassemble their faces, to wipe their eyes or pretend they weren't crying, and as I stood up, I overheard snippets of conversation that sounded less like, "that movie was good," and more like, "I should call my mom, I need to visit home. I get why my brother is the way he is now," and that, to me, is the mark of a film that has done something more than just entertain. It sparked introspection, maybe even action, even if that action is just a text, a journal entry, a moment of self-compassion. For me, personally, Luka Duka Lama felt like one of those rare narrative experiences that blur the line between media and memory, the same way certain story-driven games do when you realize you're not just guiding a character through their world, you're being gently led through your own internal landscape at the same time. It made me think of all the save points in my own life I wish I could go back to, not to change what happened, but to sit with my younger self and say, "You're not crazy, this is actually hard, and you're allowed to feel it." And if a film can awaken that level of self-reflection, I think it's doing something extraordinary. So, should you watch Luka Duka Lama? If you're in the mood for car chases and quick, quippy dialogue and neat moral lessons, maybe not right now. This one demands time, space, and a willingness to be uncomfortable, to swim in murky emotional water without constantly reaching for the edge, and that's not always what we're up for at the end of a long day. But if you have the bandwidth, if there's even a small part of you that has unfinished business with your own past, I highly recommend giving this film room in your schedule and in your head. Go into it the way you'd start a new long, story-rich game, knowing that you might not always enjoy every moment, but trusting that by the end, you'll have gone somewhere you needed to go. And when you're done, I'd really love to hear your thoughts, especially how certain moments intersect with your own experiences of family, of leaving home, of coming back. Did you see yourself in Olya, in Hendra, in Laras, in Raka, in Nisa, or maybe in none of them, but you recognized the patterns around them anyway? For me, Luka Duka Lama is less a movie you rate and more a mirror you choose to look into, knowing full well you might not like everything you see, but also knowing that sometimes, seeing clearly is the first step toward any kind of real change. In the end, that's what stays with me most, not a specific shot or line of dialogue, though there are many that deserve to be quoted and re-watched, but the overall feeling of having been gently, insistently invited to sit with pain instead of fast-forwarding through it, to acknowledge that new wounds are often just fresh expressions of old sorrows, and that maybe, just maybe, if we stop running long enough to turn around and face them, they'll start to lose a little of their power over us, not vanish, not magically heal, but loosen, the way a too tight knot eventually relents under patient fingers. As that final image fades and the sounds of the sea and the town dissolve into the silence of the credits, you're left alone with your own echoes, and that's where the real story continues, off-screen, in the choices you make after the lights come up. And as always, from me here at Bongo Gaming, shifting from digital worlds to cinematic ones for a moment, I want to leave you not just with analysis, but with a question that only you can answer, having watched, or even just having heard about, a film like Luka Duka Lama. What is the old sorrow in your life that your new wounds keep pointing back to, and what are you going to do with that knowledge now? And because stories like this don't stop at a fade to black, because grief and grace have the annoying habit of asking for seconds when you thought you'd cleared the table, let's keep walking with Luka Duka Lama. Let's sit a little longer in that house where the door sticks and the kettle learns your timing better than you know it yourself, because there's still so much living happening at the edges of the frame that we haven't let ourselves look at yet, like the morning after the night swim when the town yawns awake and the vendors start their quiet march down the lane, baskets balanced, jokes traded in a currency of glances and soft slaps on shoulders, and Maya moves through this choreography like someone who remembers the steps but can't trust her feet yet, the sea still on her skin, the phosphorescent afterglow dissolved but somehow humming under her nails, and the film lets us stay with her, unspectacular and true, as she buys tofu and chilies and a handful of limes that smell like clean beginnings, the vendor teasing her for paying city prices and sliding an extra lime into her bag like an apology for the years lost, like a blessing for the years that might still be saved. And if you're listening, the sound design has tucked into this moment the faint rhythm of laundry lines clacking in the breeze, the voice of a lone announcer on a local radio station mumbling a weather report like he's sitting in your kitchen, and the bit of flute that someone's kid is practicing badly 2 doors down, and these tiny audios, they're the pulse of the town, the same way your own apartment or neighborhood has a pulse you stopped noticing until you left and came back, and the camera keeps a respectful distance but makes the decision to spy on hands again, old hands exchanging money, young hands tethered to a phone, Maya's hands testing the weight of each thing she chooses, as if selecting food is an act of accountability now, as if she owes scent and texture and hunger a kind of honesty, and maybe she does, because the film understands that every ordinary action is a hinge that can open into memory if you press it right, and when she returns home and sets the bag down with the care you give something that could break even when you know it won't, you realize the house has started to absorb her again, or perhaps she's learning the house's rules fresh. It's a mutual re-education. And I love that the film gives us that domestic negotiation without commentary. No character stops to say wow, everything's changed, because no one does that in real life. They just bump into the same table corners and mutter the same soft curses until their bodies remember where the corners are. Pak Budi is stronger today, and the camera catches that in the slight arrogance of how he reaches for his cup, the way he doesn't wait for help, and the scene that follows is a masterpiece of stubborn tenderness. He insists on going to physio at the clinic on his own, a short walk he used to do without thinking, and Maya hovers in that infuriating orbit where love and control share the same sidewalk. She's a moon that wants to be a hand, and you can feel the shared embarrassment of parent and child caught in the act of needing each other, which is maybe what adulthood is, perpetual embarrassment at the very things that make us human. And as they pass the neighbor's gate, a group of men are playing a card game, their easy laughter salted with a gossip that wants to be kindness but keeps tripping over its own feet, and someone asks about the old rumor the town has kept in its pocket all these years, and the air gets heavy, you can feel it. But the director keeps it moving, no confrontation, no collector's edition of the past, just the elderly pause in Pak Budi's step that tells you pain can summon weather, and the weather does change, a cloud slides in front of the sun like a curtain, and that shadow, the kind that whispers rather than shouts, stretches the scene into something you taste in the back of your throat, and then it's gone, because that's how it works. The old wound putting its hand up from the back row to remind you it's still auditing the class, and you keep going because the day won't stop for your feelings no matter how much you want it to. The clinic is painted a color that could only be called hope if hope had been mixed with water until it was almost see-through, and a TV in the corner plays a soap where everyone's secrets are loud enough to be plot, and in the middle of that unsubtle noise, the physio is gentle, a woman who has the look of someone who has learned to take her time with other people's bodies because she knows haste makes enemies out of muscles and men alike. And the therapy itself, it's small, slow movements. Little victories that feel too minor for applause but are worthy of a parade, and the camera gives you one, a quiet parade of glances and exhales and the soft squeak of a rubber ball being gripped and released, and if you've ever walked beside someone through recovery, you know this is it. There's no montage magic that makes time kind, there's just repetition, and that's where this film whispers a thesis in practice: if grief repeats, so can healing, and they can take turns, like dancers, changing partners in a song that goes on longer than you wanted it to. And we're invited to be patient because patience isn't passive, it's the active choice to stay. Back home, there's a sequence with Ibusari that snuck up and got me where I live. She's sitting at the low table telling a story that may be true and may be embellished, the artist's lie that tells the heart's truth, about a time when the river flooded before she was married and the only thing she saved first was a tin of coffee because she knew if she saved that, she could save everyone else's mood when they got back. And you watch Maya laugh in a way that registers as new old, the laugh of someone remembering a muscle that used to work and has been atrophied by city life, and the grandmother's voice has that soft rumble of old engine, it calms and rattles at once, and when she pauses to catch her breath, she stares at the radio like it's an old friend with a new face, because a local station is playing Karen Kong and if you know you know, the strings carrying a sadness that refuses to be a burden, and the way the film sits with that song lets it bleed into the next scene where Maya is in her father's room, is an act of editorial courage. Because most films cut between emotion, this one lets emotion teach you how to cut your own air into smaller pieces, so you can breathe when you thought you couldn't. Raka shows up at dusk carrying a plastic bag of cassava chips and the sort of apology you don't put into words because it would break the shape of the room, and I respect that the script doesn't turn him into a romantic solution. He's not a fix or a refuge, he's a person, a constellation of choices and regrets that intersect with Maya's in a few bright points and then drift, and in their scene by the gate, the way the light has the nerve to be beautiful even when the conversation isn't easy, you can feel two people renegotiating the contract that adolescents wrote for them without consent, and if that's not familiar then you are either very young or very lucky, and the rest of us will be over here nodding, because most of us have a raka or two folded into our story, someone whose presence is both comfort and reminder. If you're watching the edges of the frame, and this film invites you to, you'll notice the way the neighborhood kids orbit Maya in these middle stretches, curiosity walking as courage, and there's a girl, intern, from the market, who keeps asking about ghosts with the kind of seriousness children bring to the subjects adults try to laugh away, and the camera does this elegant thing where it lets us see Maya see herself in intern, the way big questions press against small mouths until they slip out. Anyway, and there's a short exchange that lives rent-free in my head. Intern asks if the sea keeps the names of everyone who said goodbye there, and Maya says maybe that's what waves are, sea handwriting, and across the street, a boy drops a pail and the clatter is the punctuation the moment needed, no violin swell, just life insisting on being lived. Later, there's a scene that might be my favorite in the whole film because it's so unafraid to be quiet, a Wayang Kulit performance in a modest community hall, the screen lit from behind so the puppets are silhouettes, and the Darlang's voice is a road you could walk for miles, and the kids fidget and the elders nod and somewhere in the back Maya sits with her camera in her lap, not lifting it, because some images are meant to be held by the eyes first, and the mythology on the screen, heroes and demons and the moral mess in between, begins to rhyme with the town's stories, with Maya's, because that's what stories do, they rhyme across time until we realize we're humming a tune our grandparents danced to. And the score stays respectful, a bit of metallophone here and there to anchor you, the kind of musical decision you miss if you're not listening and then you realize it's been guiding you like a hand at your back, gentle but insistent. And since we're bongo gaming and narrative is our arena, I keep thinking about how the film's structure feels like an open-world game that refuses to gamify its grief, no quest markers blinking, no XP for saying the right apology, just a geography you ask to learn with your feet, a map you draw by walking, and the film trusts you to find the main path by following the small paths, which is how the best games work too. They let the side quests change the way the main story feels, not because you unlocked a cheat but because you lived a little more in the world. And here, a side quest might be as simple as fixing the hinge on a door or taking the long way home past a house you no longer recognize as yours and letting the ache teach you something that a direct confrontation never would. We need to talk about the bead bracelet, because the film brings it back not as a symbol hammered into shape but as an object warmed by use. In a late-night scene, Maya finds an old cassette player in a drawer that yields easily now because someone oiled it, and inside there's a tape labeled with a handwriting you will check twice, and when she presses play, after the pop and hiss that announces the beginning of memory, she hears a voice that is both familiar and not, singing softly, clumsily. And you think it's a love song until the words tilt and you realize it's a lullaby, and the time collapses on itself, the past inside the present like one of those wooden dolls inside another, and the bracelet's small clack against the plastic as she turns up the volume is the kind of sonic detail only a patient film will reward you with, because it's the sound of two memories grazing each other. And when Pak Booty wakes and shuffles to the doorway and watches his daughter listen to a voice he once loved with his whole afternoon, the film does not force tears, it holds the pose and lets you feel your own. You might be asking, do we ever get the answer about the thing near the mangroves, about the old story that stalks the new? And the film is kind enough and brave enough to give you something, not a courtroom clarity but a living room truth, which is the only kind that lasts, and it happens on a day when the rain turns the world that green that seems impossible, 100 shades in an hour, and Maya, after a small push from Ibusari who knows which absences need to be named aloud before they become curses, walks down to the beach that has been underlying everything, and she meets someone she's been avoiding like we avoid our mirrors when we know we're wrecked, and the conversation that follows has the shape of a confession and the texture of a negotiation, and it's beautiful because it refuses the cheap currency of absolution. Instead, there's this exchange that left me wrecked in the best way, where they both admit they don't remember the same day the same way, and the film allows both memories to exist without choosing one as gospel, and there's a generosity in that, a way of saying most of our worst days were a storm of limited information and too much feeling, and that listening can sometimes be a better justice than a verdict can. And the cinematography meets this ethic with the kind of softness that doesn't blur edges, it respects them, it asks you to hold contradictions like you would a sleeping child, firmly enough to keep them from falling, lightly enough not to wake them into panic. If you're counting laughs, this film doesn't shortchange you on relief either, it's just that the humor is woven into the cloth rather than sewn on as decoration, like when Ibusari cheats at a family game by looking at the reflection in a window and claims it's a blessing when caught. Or when Pak Agus fixes a radio that wasn't broken and then charges it with sounding crisper, and Maya's amusement is a little rusty at first and then it gleams. And those moments matter because healing is not grim, it's leaky. Joy sneaks in even when you think you can't afford it, and the film is wise enough to let it. Culturally, the film lands in a moment when memory work is everywhere, memoirs and personal essays and autofiction circling the same questions. Who gets to tell the story? What is the price of telling it? How do we respect the fact that multiple truths can share a room without one erasing the other? And Luka Duka Lama's contribution is to insist that the room be an actual room. A house with drawers and smells and a ceiling fan that ticks when it's hot, because when we keep memory abstract, it behaves, but when we let it live in space, it misbehaves. It wanders off and comes back with things we forgot we gave it, and that misbehavior is good. It's life in motion, and cinematically that's translated through a love of locations that feel like they existed before the camera arrived and will exist after it leaves, and maybe that's why the closing stretch feels less like a conclusion and more like a permission slip, because the filmmakers are not interested in summing up, they are interested in sending you back into your life with a new arrangement of breath. Technically, there's a small flourish in the final reel that stands out precisely because the rest is so restrained. A match cut from a child's kite to a sailboat moving along the horizon that both enlarges and simplifies the image of a line held and a line released, and in that cut there's a thesis on control that could fuel 1,000 discussions. We are not here to hold everything and everyone, we are here to hold what holds us, and to release what asks to be wind, And if that sounds like something your therapist might say, well, good, art should sometimes do the work of therapy without pretending it can replace it. Now, about pace, I said before the midsection lingers, and on rewatch, yes, it's one of those films, it starts whispering at you to revisit it as soon as you put it down. That lingering becomes less a flaw and more a fidelity to the way change actually lodges in a life. We don't pivot on a dramatic beat, we tilt over days and dishes and repeated paths, and when the tilt finally registers, it's because we've placed enough ordinary things in a new arrangement to notice the difference, and the film demonstrates that by letting us live in that repetition long enough to feel the accumulation rather than being told about it. In the conversation about performances, I want to nod at the kids again because the film uses them as both comic relief and chorus, not in a precocious twee way but as truth tellers who don't know they're telling truth, and one of them asks Maya a question so simple and devastating I wrote it down and stared at it for a while. Do grown-ups get better or just tougher? And Maya says sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both, and sometimes neither, and that quiet honesty is one of many reasons I would follow this character into another film, or into another room where the light is different and the kettle is a different brand, because she's not an answer machine, she's a question walker, and cinema needs more of those right now. The reception has, as I mentioned, been the slow burn type, which feels right. You don't gulp this and burp on Twitter, you sip it and text someone at 1 a.m. and ask if they are up, and the film has begun to gather around itself a community of people who have decided that they will not be embarrassed by softness, who will allow themselves to be moved, and if that sounds like a small thing, remember the world we live in, where cynicism is sometimes mistaken for intelligence and sincerity for nave it, and then tell me this isn't a tiny revolution, this letting yourself be touched without needing to announce it as content, and that cultural shift, even in a little corner of our viewing lives, feels like something to root for. There are minor quibbles people have had. Someone online said they wanted more explicit backstory, another said they couldn't handle the way the film refuses to name a particular thing directly, and I say fair, art isn't a one-size shirt, it's a garment that looks right on some bodies and wrong on others. But for me, the refusal to litigate the past into a neat case is the point, not because the film is coy, but because it honors the complexity of harm, because it understands that names can sometimes close doors that description can keep open, and there's mercy in that openness without a loss of moral clarity, and that's a tightrope most films wobble on and fall, but this one walks with the confidence of someone who's walked the path enough times to know where the floor creaks. I find myself thinking of the craft choices that might get overlooked in a first watch because your heart's too busy, like the way the diegetic music always comes from somewhere honest, a passing motorcycle speaker, a radio, a neighbor humming, and the score only enters when the environment has already suggested it, like a friend who doesn't knock but taps the door frame to let you know they are there, and I keep returning to the costume choices too, the way cloth carries time, sweat and sun and the stretch of reaching one shelf higher than usual, and there's a shirt Pack Booty wears that is a memory palace, patches sewn by hands you don't see on screen, and you understand community through that stitching. Someone decided this shirt would not be allowed to retire yet, and that is love, that is the politics of care distilled into something you can touch. When the film finally, gently, edges towards a goodbye, it does so without making a spectacle of it. There is no airport chase, no cliff confession, just the quiet tasks that precede leaving. A bag packed with unimportant things that suddenly glow with importance, a note left in a place where it will be found not immediately but at the right time, a final sweep of the floor not because it's dirty but because the movement itself is a way of saying thank you to the room, and Maya stands again in the doorway she stood in at the beginning, but this time she doesn't freeze, she breathes, and the breath is the difference, the breath is the life she allowed back in, and in the mirror behind her, you catch the faintest glimpse of Ibusari pretending to fuss with a plant so she won't have to say what she wants to say, and Pack Booty, who has learned the language of letting go the hard way, says be careful like he used to say it when she was 6 and trying to ride a bike, and the movie lets that line carry two timelines at once, and if that doesn't make your heart ache in gratitude for what language can hold, watch it again when you're tired and see if it doesn't find you then. If you're waiting for me to stamp a verdict on this, I've already stamped it in the tone I've been using. This is cinema that believes in us, and in turn asks us to believe in slow changes, in small mercies, in the way a town can be both trap and balm, in the way a family can be both wound and salve, and it is absolutely worth your time, and if you're the kind of viewer who wants a compass, here's one more thought to carry with you into that dark room where the light finds you from the front and the sides. look for the moments when the camera doesn't move and the world does, because that's where the film hides its truest music. That's where you'll hear the rhythm of your own days come back to you, stripped of noise and dressed in something like meaning. And when you step out into your own air afterward, if it tastes a shade different, if your neighborhood's hum suddenly sounds like a background score because you are finally listening, then the film has done its work, and so have you. Because art can open the window, but you have to breathe on purpose. And if we want to be playful, let's say this too. In a year full of final bosses and side quests and loot drops we didn't need, Luka Baru Duka Lama is that one long walk you take in a game where you put away the HUD and just let the world talk to you. It's the moment you realize the most important mechanic is patience and the only stat that matters is empathy. And the reward for finishing is not a cutscene but the ability to look at your own life with a little less hardness and a little more light, and maybe you carry that forward into everything else you play and watch and do. And that would make this film not just a story you consumed but one that taught you how to consume your own days with more care, which is the kind of DLC life should always come with but rarely does. All of which is to say, if you've hung with me this far, you're one of my people, someone who knows that pacing yourself through a feeling is not the same as dodging it, someone who can hold a kite string without the need to see it scrape the clouds to be satisfied, and for you, for us, this film is less an event and more a companion. The kind of companion you don't see every week because you're both busy surviving, but when you do see each other, you pick up right where you left off, and that right there is everything: continuity without performance, care without spectacle, honesty without a receipt, and you leave with your pockets full of small shiny stones the film slipped in while you weren't looking, and you find them later, in the middle of a week that isn't going well, and your fingers remember what the film taught them, to trace the scar without apologizing to it, to open the window even when the rain's loud, to pour the tea slowly because the cup wants to be warmed before it can hold the heat, and I don't know how else to say it, but that's where this movie lives now, not on the screen but in the small choreography of how you treat what matters. If you're still listening at this point, if you didn't click away the moment the credits rolled in your own head, then I'm going to assume Luka Baru Duka Lama got its hooks into you the way it did with me, because this isn't the kind of film you casually forget, it's the kind that lingers like the aftertaste of strong coffee at 3 in the morning. When your mind is too awake to sleep and too tired to lie to itself. And what I want to do now is walk even deeper into its world, into those corners we only brushed against before, because the more time you spend with this movie in your memory, the more details start surfacing like objects floating up after a long dive, pieces you didn't notice the first time suddenly glowing with new meaning. And that's one of the reasons this film feels so alive. It's not a one-and-done experience, it's something that keeps unfolding after you leave the theater. Like a story-driven game where you keep discovering hidden lore long after the main campaign is finished. One of the things I barely touched on earlier, but that absolutely anchors the film, is the way it eventually reveals the full story of the storm, that central childhood trauma hovering over everything like a dark cloud we're always walking underneath. Early in the film, like I mentioned, we only get these fragmented flashes, like corrupted video files, a flash of water rushing under a door, the silhouette of someone shouting in the rain, the glow of a candle knocked over, a child's voice screaming a name that gets swallowed by thunder, and in those early scenes, it feels like the movie is respecting Olya's own refusal to remember the full thing, because our brains do that when memory becomes too dangerous. They cut and splice, they hide the worst frame in the middle of static, but Nadia Pratiwi is too honest a storyteller to leave it forever chopped up like that, so as Olya slowly lets herself re-enter those memories, the film's flashbacks become longer, more coherent, more painful. The big storm sequence, when it finally arrives in one extended, fully realized flashback near the end of the second act, isn't shot like a disaster spectacle with huge effects and dramatic slow motion. It's shot almost like a documentary, handheld, claustrophobic, mostly from Olya's teenage point of view inside the house, which makes everything both blurrier and more intimate, because we're not watching a flood, capital F, we're watching this one family-specific night of terror. Rain battering the tin roof so loud it sounds like static, Hendra barking orders as he lifts furniture onto higher ground, young Olya frantically gathering photos and school certificates because she's been told those are important, her mother, Sinta, moving between them with this tight, efficient calm that you only really understand in hindsight was pure fear wearing the mask of control, as the water seeps under the front door, as the electricity cuts and they are plunged into darkness lit only by candles and the occasional flash of lightning. The film finally lets us see what Olya has buried, her father's shaking hands as he tries to latch the windows, his voice cracking as he calls on God under his breath, her mother insisting on checking on an elderly neighbor down the street even as the water creeps up to their ankles, the argument that follows when Hendra tries to forbid her from leaving, his pride and his fear clashing in front of his daughter like two different fathers she's never seen at the same time before, and then, in a series of quick, frantic shots, we see what young Olya remembers most vividly and has been running from ever since, the moment Cinta steps out into the storm despite Hendra's desperate shouting, the way the door slams in the wind, the sound of something heavy collapsing outside, and then the long, horrible hours of not knowing, of waiting in a house that's slowly filling with cold, muddy water, clinging to floating objects like driftwood inside your own home, until finally, when the neighbors manage to help them to a higher safe point as dawn breaks, there's still no sign of Cinta. The film doesn't show her body, it never does, and that absence becomes the wound itself, the missing piece that has shaped the whole architecture of Olya's life, because there's a certain kind of grief that never fully closes when there's no physical goodbye, just a door that opened once and never opened again. When you see this sequence, when you watch teenage Olya, soaked and shivering on a crowded community center floor, listening as half-heard rumors trickle in about a woman swept away in the current, about a neighbor's house that collapsed, about a road that no longer exists, you understand in your bones why her relationship with Hendra was poisoned from that day forward, because from Olya's perspective, it wasn't the storm that took her mother, it was the argument, it was the years of stubbornness and emotional distance that culminated in that one night where he couldn't say, "I need you, I'm scared," and instead shouted orders, forbade, controlled, until the one person who held the family's emotional center together chose to risk herself for others rather than stay in that house full of command and fear, and teenage Olya, whose world has literally and figuratively collapsed, picks an antagonist to survive against, and that antagonist becomes her father. What the film does so brilliantly, though, is that it doesn't leave the narrative at that single, adolescent vantage point. Once adult Olya has unearthed that old box, read the half-burned letter her mother apparently wrote but never sent, once she's found that photograph of Hendra and Cinta at a community meeting after the storm planning committee, where Hendra's face is hollowed out with exhaustion but his hand is resting lightly on the back of a child from another family, you start to see another version of that night unfold in her mind, and this is where the movie quietly, delicately rewrites, not the facts, but the emotional interpretation of those facts. In a later, softer flashback, framed less as trauma and more as remembered humanity, we see a different angle. Hendra outside in the days after the flood, wading chest-deep in water alongside other men, looking for survivors, his voice hoarse from shouting names, his legs shaking with cold and grief, returning home empty-handed night after night, his shoulders more hunched every time, and no one has to say it. But you feel that the harshness that later defined his parenting, the rigidity and quick temper, came from a man who never forgave himself for not chaining the door shut, forever letting Cinta out into that storm, from a man who then decided, in his own warped survival logic, that the only way to protect his remaining child in a fragile world was to become harder than the world, stricter than the world, angrier than the world, because in his mind, softness equaled loss. None of that excuses the pain he caused Olya, and the movie never asks you to suddenly absolve him, but it does something more unsettling. It invites you to place his cruelty and her resentment side by side on the same table and look at them both under the same hurt light, to see that there's no pure villain here, just two people stuck in the same storm long after the water has receded. That multi-perspective approach to trauma is what makes the emotional experience of Luka Baru Duka Lama so dense. It's almost like the director is saying, here is the main quest, but here are all these side quests, these parallel storylines that color your understanding of the main one, and by the time you've watched the film, you're left with this web of interconnected pains and small kindnesses instead of a simple straight line from cause to effect. That web also extends to the town itself, and the more you think about it, the more you realize how carefully Nadia Pratiwi uses wearing in as more than a backdrop. It's like the town is a big open-world map, and every street has its own mini-story that ties back to the central theme of new wounds growing out of old sorrow. Remember the land dispute subplot I mentioned? The one that, on first watch, might seem like a bit of narrative background noise. When you really lean into it, you start to see how it's not random at all. The same coastline that almost killed them years ago is now being carved up and sold in pieces to developers who see only beach views, not the history embedded in every rock and mangrove root, and the families who stayed, like Rakas, are being pressured to sign away land that's been in their bloodline for generations in exchange for promises of money that may or may not ever materialize. Watching Raka stand on the shore with a blandly smiling consultant explaining the future, wearing in Bay Resort, in bright 3D renderings that completely erase the small boats and drying fish racks and kids playing soccer in the sand, you feel that familiar ache of modernization that doesn't care who it dispossesses, and you also see how this new wound opens up older sorrows, Raka's resentment toward people like Olya who left, his insecurity about his own worth in a system that values concrete over community, his quiet anger at his late father for never teaching him how to navigate contracts and money the way he taught him how to read the tide. In that sense, the town is experiencing its own kind of generational trauma. First the water came and tried to take everything in one violent night, and now corporations are coming softly, with meetings and nice brochures, trying to take everything in a slow drip. And so, when Olya and Raka find themselves sitting on the steps of Ibusari's stall listening to the older woman talk about how, Dulu, our grief was something we shared, how in the old days after the storm everyone mourned together, cooked together, rebuilt together, whereas now everyone seems to grieve privately, behind closed doors, ashamed of their struggles in the age of Instagram and perfect lives, you realize that one of the movie's quiet pleas is for a return to communal processing, too. The idea that sorrow is not something you lock in your own chest like a guilty secret, but something you let breathe in the company of others. That comes through in the religious elements too. Wearing In is a town where faith is woven into daily life, with the call to prayer punctuating the day like a chorus, and the film treats that with respect but also with nuance, showing how faith can be a comfort and a cage at the same time. There's a beautifully complicated scene where Olya, who in the city has let her religious practices become more relaxed, joins her family for a communal prayer night for Hendra's health. She feels like a stranger at first, misaligned in the synchronized movements, her lips stumbling over verses that once rolled easily from her tongue, but as the prayer continues, the camera moves across the small room, catching the faces of each participant, Lara's eyes closed tightly, silently begging not just for Hendra but for a break from the endless cycle of caretaking, Ibusari, muttering words she knows by heart while thinking about the son who moved to another island and never comes home, Raka's mother, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes as she whispers the names of the dead from the storm, even Hendra himself, seated in the corner, his brow furrowed, perhaps asking for forgiveness, perhaps too proud to ask for anything. In that moment, prayer becomes less about doctrine and more about a shared expression of helplessness, a way for the community to sit with what they cannot fix, and for a brief moment, you can see something in Olya soften as she stops resisting the ritual and lets herself fall into the rhythm, not because she suddenly becomes devout again, but because she remembers what it feels like to be part of something larger than her own narrative of hurt. But the film is also honest about how religious language can be used to silence legitimate anger. Earlier, when Olya dares to bring up the past, to speak openly about how Hendra treated her after Sinta died, an older relative quickly interjects with, Sudala, it's all takdir, God's will, don't open old wounds, and in that line, you can hear centuries of weaponized fatalism that has told people, especially young women, to endure and never disturb the family's fragile peace with uncomfortable truth. The title itself, Luka Baru Duka Lama, is almost a rebuttal to that mindset. It's the film saying, old sorrow doesn't disappear when you refuse to look at it, it just grows new wounds in the present, and watching Olya push back against that, even clumsily, feels like watching someone reach for the talk about it dialogue option in a game that's conditioned them to always choose, stay silent. One of my favorite small scenes that really captures this tension is when Nisa, the teenage girl who idolizes Olya, comes to her after school one day, clearly upset, and confesses that she's been having panic attacks whenever it rains heavily, that she feels embarrassed because everyone else is normal, and Olya, for the first time in the film, gets to be fully in her element, not as a daughter or a victim but as a caregiver who understands both the science and the soul of what's happening. She gently explains to Nisa what anxiety is, that it's not a sign of weakness or lack of faith, but a natural response to fear, and she even does a breathing exercise with her, counting together as the sound of rain taps on the window. It's a quiet, healing moment that shows us what can happen when someone who has spent so long running from their own pain finally uses their experience to ease someone else's, and in that sense, the movie suggests that one of the ways we can redeem our own stories is by breaking their worst patterns when we see them starting again in younger people. It's like the film is inventing a tiny side quest for Olya, protect Nisa from inheriting the same unspoken grief. Now, from a purely cinematic standpoint, we have to talk more about how all of this is delivered visually and rhythmically, because it's not just what the story is, it's how it's told that makes you feel like you've been sitting inside someone's memory for 2 hours rather than just watching a neatly constructed narrative. Nadia Pratiwi and her cinematographer lean heavily into long takes, especially during confrontations. There are arguments that play out in a single, unbroken shot, the camera subtly repositioning but never cutting away, so you have no relief, no chance to step outside the moment. You're stuck there with the characters as their tempers rise and their composure cracks. One particularly intense sequence has Olya and Hendra in the living room, late at night, the only light coming from a flickering TV that no one is really watching. They start with what seems like a logistical discussion about his medication schedule, but it quickly veers into old accusations, into Olya finally spitting out, "You cared more about your pride than about me," and Hendra firing back with, "You think you're the only one who suffered," and as they volley years of resentment back and forth, the camera slowly circles them, like it's trapped in the orbit of their unresolved conflict, and the lack of cuts means you see every micro-expression, every moment where one of them wants to back down but doesn't, every second where an apology almost slips out but gets swallowed. It's emotionally exhausting to watch, almost like being in the room with relatives you care about who you can't mediate for, and by the end of it I found myself physically tense, shoulders up, breathing shallow, which is a testament to how immersive that choice of filmmaking can be when done with intention. Contrast that with how the flashbacks are often shot, sometimes in slightly grainier, warmer tones, sometimes with more cuts, reflecting the fragmented way memory works, so the present is these long, suffocating stretches of inescapable reality, while the past is a series of flashes you can't fully hold on to, which is the exact reverse of how nostalgia usually works in cinema, where the past is romanticized and the present is harsh. Here, the past is unstable and the present is heavy but solid. And that inversion subtly reinforces the idea that Olya's healing can only happen now, in the grounded, difficult interactions she's having, not by endlessly replaying a cleaner, more coherent version of back then that never actually existed. The film's editing also plays with time in a way that will feel familiar to anyone who's ever gotten lost in a long gaming session. You know that weird disorientation when you look up and hours have passed, but your mind feels like it's been in one continuous moment. Luka Duka Lama replicates that by sometimes jumping forward in small, almost imperceptible skips. 1 second Olya is pouring tea in the kitchen, the next she's halfway through washing the cups, and the conversation she's having hasn't skipped a beat, and it gives you the sense that days are blurring together, that the longer she stays in wearing in, the more her sense of time dilates, the way it often does when we return to places from our childhood and suddenly feel the years collapse in on themselves. On the performance side beyond our main duo, I want to give some love to the ensemble, because they are a huge part of why this world feels so lived in. Ibusari's actress, Sri Lestari, has this way of filling every scene with a kind of stubborn tenderness, like the world has tried to grind her down but she's found a way to stay generous without becoming naive, and there's a moment where she tells Olya, "You don't owe anyone a performance of being okay," while casually slicing vegetables, and you realize that she might be the only adult in Olya's childhood who ever modeled emotional honesty, and it hits you that sometimes the role models who keep us afloat aren't our parents, but these adjacent figures, neighbors, teachers, stall owners, NPCs in the background of our childhood maps who ended up being lifelines. Meanwhile, Dimas Wirawan as Raka gives this beautifully grounded performance as a man who's made peace with some of his choices but not all of them. There's this scene where he plays guitar at a small local bar, singing a song that he and Olya used to sing as kids, and the camera cuts between his face, focused and a little sad, and Olya sitting in the back, half hidden in shadow, fighting tears. The lyrics talk about waves always returning to the shore, no matter how far out they go, and yeah, it's on the nose, but sometimes you need on the nose when your whole life has been spent pretending not to see the obvious. Watching that, I thought of all the friends in our lives who stay in one place while we roam, the ones we maybe look down on a little when we leave because we think forward motion is the only sign of growth, only to realize later they've been growing, too, just in a different, deeper direction, putting down roots while we've been busy chasing horizons. The movie lets Raka embody that quiet, rooted growth without turning him into a martyr or a prize for Olya if she chooses to stay, and that restraint felt really respectful. Now, on the topic of audience reaction and cultural impact, because that's an important part of any review, especially for a film so tied to a specific place and language, it's been fascinating to watch how people talk about Luka Duka Lama online and in person. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of viewers have this deeply personal response to it, commenting that it feels too real, that they saw their own fathers, mothers, siblings in these characters, that certain lines felt like they'd been eavesdropping on conversations in their own houses. You see posts from people saying, "I thought I was the only one who left home like that," or, "I didn't know other people had this weird relationship with their dad where you simultaneously love him and can't stand being in the same room." And that's the kind of communal recognition good art can spark, exposing how many of us are walking around with similar scars but convinced we're alone because we never talk about them. At the same time, there has also been some pushback, particularly from older viewers or more traditional audiences, who feel that the film is too harsh on parents, or that it encourages rebellion by validating Olya's anger. There have been op-eds arguing that, anak sekarang terlalu lembek, that young people today are too soft, too quick to call everything trauma instead of just accepting that life is hard. And while I don't agree with that take, I think it's revealing, because it shows exactly the generational divide the movie is trying to illuminate. When a film about pain causes argument between generations, when parents and children leave the theater and end up debating not the film's technical merits but the legitimacy of each other's feelings, that means it's touched a nerve that was already there. The movie didn't create the wound, it just pointed to it. And that, in a way, is art doing something very, very productive, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment when voices are raised and someone says, "You're being disrespectful," just because you empathized with a fictional character who questioned their parents. For those of us watching from outside that exact cultural context, it's also a reminder to be humble in our interpretation. It's easy to bring our own frameworks and say, "Of course Olya is right, of course she should confront him." But in communities where filial piety is deeply ingrained, where family hierarchies are sacred, standing up like that isn't just a personal decision, it's a social and spiritual one, and the film acknowledges that weight without bluntly spelling it out. What I love is that Nadia Pratiwi doesn't make the choice for us. She doesn't say, "Here's the correct way to handle an abusive or neglectful parent." She just shows this one woman figuring it out in the context of her town, her faith, her history, and we're left to decide how much of that resonates with our own situations. The more we talk about Luka Duka Lama, the more it becomes clear that it's less interested in giving you answers and more interested in giving you a vocabulary of images and moments for articulating questions you may not have known how to ask before, like, what does forgiveness actually look like when the person who hurt you never fully admits what they did? Is it something you extend to them, or something you give yourself? Are you allowed to walk away even if they are sick, even if everyone around you calls that cruel? Can you honor the sacrifices your parents made while also acknowledging the damage they did? These aren't hypothetical, film school questions, they are the kind of dilemmas people cry about in therapists' offices or pray about at 3 a.m., and seeing them dramatized with this level of honesty can be both validating and destabilizing. If you're someone who has always believed you owe your parents everything, watching Olya pull away, speak up, leave, might be terrifying. If you're someone who has already cut ties completely, watching her choose to care for Hendra in small ways might feel like a betrayal of that boundary, but the film's refusal to position her choices as universal prescriptions is, I think, one of its most ethical choices as storytelling. It humbly remains, this is her path, and trusts you to find your own way through the emotional labyrinth it draws. And circling back to the way I experience stories as someone who spends most days immersed in games, I can't help but see Luka Duka Lama as almost a masterclass in non-interactive interactivity, in making you feel like you're making choices even though the narrative is fixed. As you watch Olya stand in doorways, in crossroads, in front of the sea, you project your own options onto her. You imagine what you would do, what you wish you'd done in similar situations, and in that imaginative act, the film kind of becomes a game you're playing internally, with your own history as the save file. No, you can't reload and test different dialogue options here, but you can mentally rehearse them, and maybe, just maybe, that rehearsal will change how you speak in your own real-life cutscenes later. So, when I think about my final verdict on Luka Duka Lama, it feels almost strange to talk in terms of scores or thumbs up, because how do you rate a mirror? What I can say is this: as a piece of cinema, it is beautifully crafted, emotionally precise, occasionally messy in ways that feel thrillingly human, and as a piece of cultural conversation, it's vital, especially in a time when we desperately need more stories that bridge generational gaps rather than widen them. It's not an easy watch, and it's not meant to be. It's the narrative equivalent of finally opening that drawer in your heart you've been pretending isn't overflowing, and if you're not ready to do that, it might not be the right moment for you to press play. But if you are ready, or if you're at least curious about what might happen if you stop avoiding your own storm for 2 hours, then I think this film can be, if not healing in itself, then at least a companion to you as you start or continue that healing process. When the screen goes dark and the sound of the sea fades out, what you're left with is yourself, your memories, your choices, and maybe, if the film has done its work, a slightly softened stance toward your own younger self who did the best they could with the tools they had. And if you've stuck with me through all of this, if hearing about Olya, Hendra, Waringen, and all the ghosts that haunt them has stirred something in you, then I want to gently throw the same question back into your lap that this film kept whispering to me. In your own life, what are the new wounds that keep tracing the outline of old sorrows, and what would it look like, even in the smallest way, to stop running from them and turn around?